In the autumn of 1918, a peculiar silence began to settle across American cities and towns. Not the peaceful quiet of evening, but something far more unsettling. The absence of ordinary life. Streets that once bustled with merchants calling their wares grew hushed. Schools that normally rang with children's laughter stood empty. Even the great urban centers, those monuments to American progress and industry, found themselves wrapped in an eerie calm that seemed to muffle the very heartbeat of the nation. You might imagine walking through Philadelphia or Boston during those strange months, your footsteps echoing against shuttered storefronts, the usual symphony of city life reduced to whispers. The clatter of horse-drawn carriages that had filled the streets for generations now came sporadically, their wheels rolling over cobblestones with an almost apologetic quietness. The vendors who had traditionally filled the air with their calls, "Fresh bread, milk and eggs, papers, get your papers," either stayed home behind locked doors or spoke in subdued tones that barely carried across the emptied sidewalks. This was America in the grip of the 1918 influenza pandemic, a silent enemy that moved faster than armies, struck harder than any battle, and left scars that would remain invisible for generations. The virus had no respect for borders, no regard for social standing, no consideration for age or vigor. It moved through communities like fog rolling in from the sea, quiet and relentless, transforming everything it touched. The silence was not uniform across the nation. In some places it came suddenly, like the snuffing of a candle. In others it crept in gradually, so that families hardly noticed at first when their neighbors stopped visiting, when the evening conversations from front porches grew increasingly rare, when the sounds of children playing in the streets became increasingly rare. But everywhere it touched, the pandemic left behind an absence that was almost tangible. The missing voices of friends and relatives, the empty chairs at dinner tables, the unspoken conversations that would never take place. Picture yourself standing on a street corner in any American city during October 1918. The architecture would have been familiar, the same brick buildings, the same sidewalks, the same lampposts that had defined urban America for decades. But the human element that gave these places meaning would have been eerily diminished. Instead of the normal flow of pedestrians going about their daily business, you might see only occasional figures hurrying past with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, their eyes avoiding contact with strangers who might carry invisible danger. The pandemic had a way of making the familiar seem foreign. Neighborhoods where families had known each other for generations suddenly became collections of isolated households, each family turning inward to protect itself from an enemy that could not be seen or fought with conventional weapons. The social bonds that had held communities together, the church gatherings, the school events, the informal visits between neighbors, were suddenly perceived as pathways for death rather than sources of comfort and connection. Tonight, we journey back to that time of unprecedented quiet, when an entire nation held its breath against an invisible threat. We'll explore how a microscopic virus managed to silence the land of the free, transforming bustling communities into ghost towns and revealing both the fragility and resilience of the human spirit. This is the story of when America went silent, and what that silence taught us about ourselves, our communities, and the delicate threads that bind society together. The influenza pandemic of 1918 was not just a medical crisis. It was a profound test of American character, institutions, and values. It challenged every assumption about progress, prosperity, and the ability of human ingenuity to overcome natural obstacles. In a nation that had grown accustomed to conquering frontiers, building great cities, and asserting its will over the natural world, the pandemic represented a humbling reminder that some forces remained beyond human control. As we begin this journey into one of the darkest periods in American history, we'll discover that even in the deepest silence, there were sounds of hope, the whispered prayers of the faithful, the gentle words of comfort from those who risked their own lives to care for others, the soft lullabies sung by mothers to children who might not see another dawn. These quiet acts of love and courage, occurring in the spaces between the official histories, remind us that even in the face of overwhelming tragedy, the human capacity for compassion and connection endures. The silence that fell over America in 1918 was both an ending and a beginning. It marked the end of an age of innocence when Americans believed that medical science and social progress could protect them from the ancient scourges that had plagued humanity throughout history. But it also marked the beginning of a deeper understanding of community, interdependence, and the precious nature of ordinary life. In learning to listen to that silence, we can hear echoes that still resonate in our own time, reminding us of lessons that remain as relevant today as they were over a century ago. The spring of 1918 found America deeply absorbed in the Great War, a conflict that had already consumed much of Europe and now demanded increasing American participation. Young men marched in formation across training camps from Georgia to California, their voices raised in patriotic songs, their boots keeping time against packed earth that had been transformed from farmland into military installations. The rhythm of wartime production hummed through factories from Detroit to Pittsburgh, where assembly lines worked around the clock to produce the materials of modern warfare. Despite the ocean between America and the European battlefields, the entire nation pulsed with purpose and energy, united by a common cause and confident in its ability to tip the balance of the global conflict. The military camps that dotted the American landscape represented a remarkable mobilization of human resources. These installations, many built hastily to accommodate the rapid expansion of the armed forces, housed tens of thousands of young men drawn from every corner of the Republic. Farm boys from Iowa found themselves bunking next to factory workers from Massachusetts. Cowboys from Montana shared mess halls with clerks from New York City. This great mixing of American youth created unprecedented opportunities for cultural exchange and national unity, but it also created ideal conditions for the transmission of infectious diseases. It was in this atmosphere of collective determination and unprecedented social mixing that the first seemingly innocent cases appeared. At Camp Funston in Kansas, nestled among the rolling plains where wheat grew tall and the horizon stretched endlessly towards both coasts, a cook named Albert Gitchell reported to the camp hospital on the morning of March 4, 1918. The date would later be remembered as significant, but at the time it seemed like just another routine sick call in a facility that handled hundreds of minor medical complaints each week. Gitchell, a sturdy young man from the Kansas farmland who had enlisted with patriotic enthusiasm, complained of fever, headache, and muscle aches, symptoms so common among the thousands of soldiers living in close quarters that the medical staff barely took notice. The camp hospital, a collection of wooden buildings connected by covered walkways, had been designed to handle the predictable ailments of military life: injuries from training exercises, digestive problems from institutional food, and the occasional outbreak of measles or mumps that typically moved through populations of young men living in dormitory-style conditions. Imagine yourself in that army hospital on that crisp March morning, the smell of carbolic acid mingling with the earthy scent of Kansas soil carried in on soldiers' boots. The ward would have been filled with the usual complaints of military life: twisted ankles from long marches across uneven terrain, cuts and bruises from training exercises with unfamiliar equipment, the occasional bout of homesickness that manifested in physical symptoms, and what the medical staff called la grippe, a catch-all term for influenza-like illnesses that seemed to be an inevitable part of military service. The hospital staff, led by camp physician Dr. Edward Schreiner, had established efficient routines for processing the steady stream of soldiers seeking medical attention. Nurses, many of them recent graduates from civilian nursing programs who had volunteered for military service, moved between beds with practiced efficiency, taking temperatures, dispensing aspirin, and offering the kind of maternal comfort that helped ease the transition from civilian to military life for young men far from home for the first time. Dr. Schreiner himself was a methodical man in his 50s, with graying hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that gave him a scholarly appearance. He had practiced medicine in small Kansas towns for over 2 decades before volunteering for military service, driven by a sense of patriotic duty and professional obligation. His experience treating the ailments of farming communities had given him a practical approach to medicine that focused on helping people return to productive work as quickly as possible. But within hours of Gitchell's admission, more soldiers began arriving at the infirmary with identical symptoms. By noon, over 100 men had reported for sick call, their faces flushed with fever, their bodies aching with a pain that seemed to penetrate to the bone. By week's end, that number had swelled to over 500 cases, transforming the routine operations of the camp hospital into something approaching a crisis. The virus, as medical science would eventually understand it, moved through the close quarters of the camp with a precision that would have impressed any military strategist. Soldiers shared everything in those days. Barracks, where dozens of men slept in rows of narrow cots, mess halls, where hundreds gathered 3 times daily for communal meals, training facilities, where they practiced the skills of modern warfare in close formation, and even the very air they breathed in the crisp morning assemblies, where they stood shoulder to shoulder, while officers called out the day's assignments. Each cough became a potential weapon in an invisible war. Each shared meal, an opportunity for the pathogen to leap from one host to another. Each moment of camaraderie and brotherhood, a bridge that the virus could cross with unprecedented efficiency. The social bonds that made military service bearable, the friendships forged in shared hardship, the mutual support that helped young men cope with the stress of preparing for combat, became the very mechanisms by which the pandemic would spread. The barracks themselves, hastily constructed wooden buildings designed for efficiency rather than health, provided ideal conditions for respiratory transmission. Long, narrow rooms housed dozens of soldiers in close proximity, with little ventilation beyond what could be provided by windows that were often kept closed against the harsh Kansas weather. The air in these spaces grew thick with the exhalations of sleeping men, creating an atmosphere where microscopic droplets could linger for hours, waiting for susceptible hosts. During training exercises, soldiers worked in close formation, their heavy breathing from physical exertion creating clouds of moisture that hung in the cool spring air.
Drill instructors, focused on preparing these young men for the realities of trench warfare, paid little attention to the spacing between recruits or the health implications of extended close contact. The priority was military readiness, not disease prevention, and the medical concepts that might have informed different practices were not yet well understood, even by healthcare professionals.
What made this particular strain of influenza so insidious during its initial appearance was not just its contagiousness, but its ability to hide in plain sight among the normal discomforts of military life. The symptoms, fever, body aches, fatigue, headaches, were so familiar to military physicians that many dismissed them as the natural consequence of rigorous training, institutional food, and the psychological stress of preparing for combat overseas. Soldiers, trained to endure discomfort and push through physical challenges, would often continue their duties even as their bodies fought an invisible battle against viral invasion. This stoic determination, so admirable in the context of military service and so essential for building the fighting force that America needed, became the virus's greatest ally in establishing itself within the military population. The culture of military service in 1918 emphasized toughness, endurance, and the subordination of individual comfort to collective goals. Soldiers who complained of minor ailments were often viewed as malingerers or weaklings, creating social pressure to minimize symptoms and continue participating in all activities. This cultural context meant that infected individuals continued to interact with their comrades long after they had become contagious, unwittingly serving as vectors for further transmission. From Camp Funston, the infection spread along the arteries of American infrastructure with methodical efficiency that revealed the interconnected nature of modern society. Soldiers transferred to other bases carried the virus with them in their luggage and in their lungs. Supply trains that connected the camp to the broader rail network became unwitting vessels of transmission, their cars carrying not just military equipment and provisions, but also invisible passengers that would eventually reach civilian populations throughout the region. The railway system, which had been one of America's greatest achievements in binding together a vast continental nation, now served as a highway for disease transmission. Trains that had once symbolized progress, opportunity, and the conquest of geographical barriers became vehicles for spreading a pandemic that recognized no borders and respected no boundaries. You can picture the scene at railway stations across the Midwest during those early weeks of spring 1918. Passengers waiting on wooden benches, their breath visible in the cool air, sharing news and stories as they traveled between cities for business, family visits, or military service. Children pressed their faces to train windows, watching the landscape roll by as their families moved from one community to another, while adults dozed fitfully in their seats, unaware that they might be breathing in invisible threats or exhaling dangers to their fellow travelers. The waiting rooms of these stations, often crowded and poorly ventilated, provided ideal conditions for respiratory transmission. Travelers would gather for hours before departure, sharing the same airspace and often the same eating establishments. The intimacy forced by travel conditions, strangers sitting side by side, sharing armrests and breathing the same recycled air, created countless opportunities for the virus to move between individuals who would never see each other again, but who were now connected by invisible threads of transmission. The military camps, with their constant movement of personnel and supplies, proved to be ideal launching points for what would become a global catastrophe.
Camp Devens in Massachusetts, situated near Boston and connected to major transportation networks, reported similar outbreaks within weeks of the Kansas cases. Camp Upton in New York, which processed thousands of recruits from the heavily populated Northeast, became another epicenter of viral transmission. Camp Lewis in Washington, serving the Pacific Northwest, soon joined the growing list of military installations dealing with unusual patterns of respiratory illness. One by one, these installations reported outbreaks that followed a similar pattern. Initial cases that seemed routine, rapid acceleration in the number of affected soldiers, and symptoms that were more severe than typical seasonal influenza. Medical officers trained to handle battlefield wounds and tropical diseases that might be encountered in overseas service found themselves confronting something entirely outside their experience and training.
Dr. Victor Vaughan, a respected military physician who would later document his experiences during the pandemic, described his growing concern as reports filtered in from camps across the country. As a professor of medicine at the University of Michigan before his military service, Vaughan had extensive experience with infectious diseases, but the pattern emerging in the spring of 1918 was unlike anything he had encountered in his professional career. The age distribution of the affected soldiers was particularly puzzling to medical professionals. Traditional influenza typically claimed the very young, whose immune systems were still developing, and the elderly, whose defenses had been weakened by age and accumulated health problems. But this strain seemed to target precisely the demographic that should have been most resilient: healthy adults between the ages of 18 and 30, the very population that had been selected for military service based on their physical fitness and vigor. Camp hospitals, designed to handle routine medical needs and minor injuries, found themselves overwhelmed by the volume and severity of respiratory cases. Hospital tents that had been adequate for peacetime operations now proved insufficient for the flood of seriously ill soldiers. Medical staff worked extended shifts trying to provide care for patients whose conditions seemed to deteriorate with alarming rapidity. The sound in those hospital tents was unlike anything that medical personnel had encountered in their training or previous experience. Instead of the sharp cries typical of battle wounds or the quiet moaning associated with more familiar illnesses, there was a constant, labored breathing, a wet, struggling sound as lungs filled with fluid and bodies fought desperately for oxygen. It was a sound that would haunt medical personnel for years to come, a rhythm of distress that spoke of the body's most fundamental systems under siege by an enemy they could not see or fully understand. What troubled the physicians most profoundly was not just the severity of individual cases, but the pattern of who fell ill and how quickly the disease progressed. These were soldiers who had passed rigorous physical examinations, young men who represented the peak of human health and vitality. Yet within hours of developing symptoms, some would progress from mild discomfort to life-threatening illness. The speed of this progression defied everything that military physicians thought they understood about respiratory infections. The medical explanation for this seemingly paradoxical pattern, though unknown at the time, lay in the virus's ability to trigger what doctors would later term a cytokine storm. The stronger a person's immune system, the more violently it reacted to this particular viral infection, essentially turning the body's defenses against itself. Those robust young adults with their vigorous immune responses became the victims of their own biological strength, their healthy immune systems mounting reactions so severe that they caused more damage than the virus itself. As spring gave way to the warmer days of early summer,
reports began filtering in from civilian populations living near the military installations. The virus, having established itself firmly in the military camps, began its inevitable migration into the broader American community. Factory workers living in towns adjacent to the bases started calling in sick with symptoms that matched those reported from the military hospitals. Families hosting soldiers on weekend passes found themselves bedridden with fevers and body aches. The pathogen moved with the steady persistence of rising water, seeping into every corner of American life with patient determination. In small towns across the prairie states, family physicians who had practiced for decades began encountering cases that puzzled and concerned them. The local doctor in a typical Kansas farming community, accustomed to treating broken bones from farm accidents, complications from difficult childbirths, and the seasonal ailments that came with harsh winters and demanding agricultural work, suddenly found his waiting room filled with patients exhibiting symptoms he couldn't quite categorize or treat effectively. Dr. Samuel Morton, who had served the farming community of Hays, Kansas for over 30 years, kept detailed records of his practice that would later provide historians with insight into the pandemic's rural impact. His case notes from April and May 1918 show his growing puzzlement as he encountered respiratory illness that was more severe and longer-lasting than the seasonal influenza he had treated countless times before. The rhythm of rural life, so dependent on seasonal cycles and community cooperation, began to show the first signs of disruption as more families fell ill simultaneously. Church socials, which had provided essential opportunities for isolated farm families to maintain social connections, were postponed when half the congregation reported illness. Barn raisings, those communal efforts that epitomized frontier cooperation and mutual support, were cancelled when the families who had pledged to help found themselves confined to their beds, too weak to participate in the physical labor that these events required. The virus was beginning to silence the social fabric of American communities, one gathering at a time, one family at a time, one relationship at a time. The interconnected web of social obligations, mutual assistance, and shared celebrations that held rural communities together started to fray as people withdrew into their individual households, focused on survival rather than community building. County fairs, which had been scheduled for early summer and which represented the highlight of the social calendar for many rural areas, faced difficult decisions about whether to proceed with planned celebrations. Fair organizers, typically volunteers drawn from local civic organizations, found themselves debating whether large gatherings might pose health risks, while also recognizing that these events provided crucial economic opportunities for local farmers and merchants. The agricultural cycle itself, which had governed rural American life for centuries, began to show signs of disruption as farm families struggled with illness during critical planting and cultivation periods. Farmers who had depended on extended family networks and community cooperation for labor-intensive activities like planting and harvesting found themselves short-handed at crucial moments in the growing season. By late spring of 1918, public health officials in major cities began to notice unusual patterns in their mortality reports that suggested something more serious than seasonal influenza was affecting their communities. Dr. Royal Copeland, the health commissioner of New York City and a trained physician with extensive experience in public health, reviewed weekly statistics that showed a troubling uptick in deaths attributed to pneumonia and influenza-related complications. The numbers weren't yet alarming enough to cause public panic or demand dramatic intervention, but they represented a deviation from expected seasonal patterns that caught the attention of trained epidemiologists. Public health in 1918 was still a relatively new field, with professionals who had been educated in the latest scientific approaches to disease prevention, but who lacked the tools and knowledge that would be available to later generations of public health practitioners. The challenge facing these early public health pioneers was the limited understanding of viral transmission that characterized medical knowledge in 1918. Germ theory, the revolutionary concept that diseases were caused by microscopic organisms, was still relatively new and not universally accepted by all medical practitioners. The specific mechanisms by which respiratory illnesses spread, the invisible droplets released by coughing and sneezing, the role of contaminated surfaces in disease transmission, the concept of asymptomatic carriers who could spread infection without showing symptoms themselves, were ideas that existed more in theoretical discussions than in practical public health policy. Most public health measures of the era focused on sanitation, quarantine of obviously ill individuals, and general recommendations for personal hygiene. The sophisticated understanding of airborne transmission, population immunity, and epidemic curves that would inform later pandemic responses simply did not exist in 1918. Public health officials were working with the best knowledge available to them, but that knowledge would prove tragically inadequate for the challenge they were about to face. As the summer of 1918 deepened and the nation's attention remained focused on the war in Europe, where American troops were finally arriving in significant numbers and beginning to influence the course of the conflict, the virus continued its patient work within American communities. It moved through neighborhoods and social networks with the methodical progress of a slow-burning fire, establishing itself in households, workplaces, and social gathering points without attracting the kind of attention that would have prompted coordinated public health responses. Like a guest who arrives uninvited but makes no immediate demands, the virus settled into American life during those spring and early summer months, waiting for the right conditions to reveal its true destructive potential. The stage was being set for what would become one of the most significant public health crises in American history. But in those early months, as the virus established its presence in communities across the nation, most Americans remained unaware that their familiar world was about to change in ways they could never have imagined. The silence was coming, carried on the breath of unsuspecting citizens going about their daily routines, but it had not yet fallen with the devastating completeness that would characterize the autumn months. Those who would later survive the pandemic would remember this period as the last time when life seemed normal, when the future appeared predictable, and when the greatest threat to American communities seemed to come from distant battlefields rather than invisible enemies that traveled in the spaces between neighbors and friends. As the summer of 1918 unfolded across America with its familiar rhythms of growing crops, family vacations, and community celebrations, a curious thing happened to the influenza outbreak that had caused such concern among military physicians during the spring months. The virus that had swept through military camps and spilled into surrounding civilian communities seemed to lose its edge, its symptoms becoming milder, its spread more contained, its impact more manageable. Like a storm that exhausts itself against the coastline, the pandemic appeared to weaken under the warm summer sun, leading many medical officers and public health officials to breathe more easily as they cautiously began to believe that the worst had passed. Medical officers who had watched with growing concern through the spring months, tracking the spread of infection through their commands and struggling to provide adequate care for unprecedented numbers of respiratory cases, found themselves cautiously optimistic as June gave way to July. Perhaps, they reasoned, this had been nothing more than a particularly aggressive seasonal outbreak, now burning itself out in the warm summer air, just as seasonal influenza typically did as temperatures rose and humidity decreased. Imagine walking through an American city during July 1918, perhaps Chicago, with its bustling stockyards where cattle from across the Midwest were processed to feed a growing urban population, or Boston, where the harbor filled daily with ships carrying supplies and personnel to support the war effort overseas. The streets would have hummed with their familiar energy, the sounds and rhythms that had characterized American urban life for decades, reasserting themselves after the disruptions of spring.
Vendors would have called out from their carts positioned on busy street corners, their voices competing with the clip-clop of horse-drawn vehicles and the occasional puttering of early automobiles. Children would have played stickball in the narrow spaces between tenement buildings, their laughter echoing off brick walls and fire escapes. The great machinery of American industry would have continued its steady rhythm, with factory whistles marking the beginning and end of shifts and the general hum of productive activity that had come to define American prosperity and progress. The crisis of spring seemed to be fading into memory, another challenge overcome by American resilience and ingenuity, another problem solved by the practical wisdom and democratic institutions that had enabled the young republic to overcome previous obstacles. Public health officials, still learning to navigate the complexities of disease surveillance in an era before sophisticated laboratory testing or rapid communication networks, cautiously began to file reports suggesting that the outbreak had run its course. This period of relative calm would later be recognized by epidemiologists as the pandemic's first wave, but at the time it felt more like a reprieve, a return to normal conditions after a brief but manageable health emergency. Dr. Rupert Blue, the Surgeon General of the United States and the nation's highest-ranking public health official, reviewed reports from across the country that showed declining infection rates and a return to more typical mortality patterns that seemed consistent with the seasonal nature of influenza outbreaks. Dr. Blue, a career public health officer with extensive experience in managing infectious disease outbreaks, had reason for cautious optimism. His office had been tracking the unusual spring outbreak through reports from military installations and civilian health departments, and the data suggested that the virus was indeed following the natural course of seasonal influenza. Appearing in late winter and early spring, intensifying briefly during cooler months, then retreating as warmer weather arrived and people spent more time outdoors in dispersed activities rather than crowded indoor gatherings. In military camps across the country, medical personnel found themselves dealing with more familiar and manageable concerns. The hospitals and infirmaries that had been overwhelmed with respiratory cases during March and April now returned to their expected caseload of training injuries, minor illnesses, and the routine health maintenance required for large populations of young men preparing for overseas deployment. The crisis atmosphere that had characterized military medical facilities during the spring gave way to more normal operations. Soldiers who had recovered from the spring outbreak were given clean bills of health and processed for overseas shipment to join the American Expeditionary Forces in France. The war effort, which had been subtly but significantly disrupted by the illness of key personnel and the diversion of medical resources to epidemic response, resumed its full pace with renewed confidence and efficiency.
The great mobilization of American resources for the European conflict, which had been the dominant focus of national energy and attention since the declaration of war in 1917, continued to accelerate during the summer months. Training camps processed thousands of recruits weekly, transforming civilian volunteers into military personnel. Factories worked around the clock to produce weapons, ammunition, vehicles, and supplies for the expanding military effort. The entire economy had been reorganized around wartime production, and the temporary disruption of spring now seemed like a minor hiccup in an otherwise smooth transition to wartime mobilization. But the virus had not disappeared. It had merely retreated, like an army regrouping and resupplying before a decisive battle. Throughout the summer months, it continued to circulate at low levels, moving quietly through populations, establishing itself in new communities, and undergoing the subtle genetic changes that would transform it from a troublesome seasonal ailment into a catastrophic killer that would reshape American society. Scientists working decades later with tools and knowledge unavailable in 1918 would understand this period as crucial to the pandemic's development, when random mutations in the viral genome were creating variants with different characteristics. Some of these mutations made the virus more transmissible, allowing it to spread more efficiently between hosts. Others altered its virulence, changing the severity of symptoms it produced. Still others modified its ability to evade human immune responses, helping it infect individuals who might otherwise have been protected by previous exposure to influenza. The mechanism of this evolutionary transformation remained completely invisible to the medical knowledge of 1918. Virologists as a scientific discipline wouldn't exist for decades, and the tools needed to study pathogens at the molecular level, electron microscopes, genetic sequencing techniques, cell culture techniques, were still in the realm of scientific fantasy. What physicians could observe was limited to the clinical picture, the symptoms experienced by patients, the progression of illness over time, and the patterns of spread through communities. The underlying biological drama playing out in countless viral particles as they replicated, mutated, and competed for survival remained completely hidden from human observation. During these quieter summer months, American society continued its wartime routines with renewed confidence and energy. Liberty Bond rallies drew enormous crowds throughout the country, with celebrities, political figures, and community leaders exhorting citizens to support the boys overseas through financial contributions to the war effort. These gatherings, often held in public squares, auditoriums, and outdoor venues, drew thousands of people together in close proximity, creating ideal conditions for respiratory pathogens to spread through populations that had no awareness of the invisible risks they were accepting. The patriotic enthusiasm that characterized these events worked against any inclination toward caution or social distancing. Citizens were encouraged to demonstrate their loyalty through public participation, and staying away from community gatherings might be interpreted as lack of patriotic commitment. The social pressure to participate in war-related activities meant that even individuals who might have been feeling mildly unwell often attended public events, unwittingly contributing to the circulation of infectious agents through the community. The summer also witnessed an acceleration in troop movements as America ramped up its military commitment to the European conflict. Trains crisscrossed the continent with increasing frequency, carrying soldiers from training camps scattered across the interior to ports of embarkation on the Atlantic coast. Ships loaded with American doughboys departed regularly from New York, Boston, Newport News, and other Atlantic ports bound for France, where they would join the millions of soldiers already locked in the deadly stalemate of trench warfare. Each of these movements represented not just strategic military positioning, but also opportunities for pathogens to travel along with their human hosts. Soldiers from different regions of the country were mixed together during transport, creating opportunities for regional variants of circulating viruses to encounter new populations.
The close quarters of military transport, crowded troop trains, overcrowded transport ships provided ideal conditions for respiratory transmission among populations of young, healthy individuals whose immune systems were primed for strong responses to viral infections. In civilian life, the rhythms of summer provided their own mixing opportunities as American families pursued the recreational activities that had become traditional parts of the seasonal cycle. Families traveled to visit relatives in other states, often using the expanding railway network to cover distances that would have been impossible for previous generations. Workers moved between cities following industrial opportunities created by wartime production demands. The general mobility that had become characteristic of American society continued unabated, with millions of people in constant motion for business, family, and recreational purposes.
The great American tradition of summer gatherings, county fairs, church picnics, family reunions, and community celebrations proceeded without the cautions that had briefly emerged during the spring outbreak. These events, which provided essential social cohesion and cultural continuity for communities across the nation, also created ideal conditions for infectious disease transmission through their combination of large crowds, shared food preparation, and extended close contact between individuals from different households and communities. You can envision a typical county fair in rural Iowa during August 1918, an event that would have drawn families from dozens of surrounding farms and small towns. Families would have arrived in horse-drawn wagons and the occasional automobile, dust rising from the dirt roads as they made their way toward the fairgrounds, where temporary structures had been erected to house livestock exhibitions, agricultural displays, and carnival attractions. Children would have run freely between the livestock barns and game booths, their laughter mixing with the sounds of carousel music and the calls of vendors selling everything from fresh lemonade to ribbon candy. Adults would have gathered in the shade of large canvas tents, sharing news and gossip while watching their children play games and compete in various contests. The air would have been filled with the mingled scents of animals, cooking food, and the dusty earth kicked up by thousands of feet. These fairs represented everything that was vital and hopeful about American community life: the celebration of agricultural abundance, the display of local craftsmanship and ingenuity, the opportunity for isolated families to reconnect with their neighbors, and the transmission of cultural values from one generation to the next. They were precisely the kind of communal celebration that makes human life rich and meaningful, bringing together people of all ages in shared appreciation of their common heritage and mutual interdependence. They were also precisely the kind of environment where respiratory pathogens thrive, with large numbers of people spending extended periods in close proximity, sharing food prepared in common kitchens, and breathing the same air in enclosed spaces like exhibition halls and dining tents. The combination of crowds, shared facilities, and the informal social mixing that characterized these events created countless opportunities for viral transmission between individuals who might otherwise have had no contact with each other. As August gave way to September, subtle signs began to appear in communities with international connections that the summer calm might be ending. Port cities, with their constant influx of travelers and cargo from around the world, started reporting unusual patterns of illness among dock workers, merchant sailors, and others whose occupations brought them into contact with people and goods from distant places.
The symptoms being reported were familiar to anyone who had observed the spring outbreak: fever, body aches, respiratory distress, and the general malaise associated with influenza. But their intensity seemed greater than what had been observed during the milder summer months. More troubling still was the speed with which some cases progressed from mild discomfort to serious illness, and the age distribution of those who became severely ill. Boston, as one of America's primary ports and a major hub for both military and civilian shipping, became an early indicator of what was to come. The city's busy harbor welcomed ships from Europe, South America, and other American ports, creating a constant flow of people and goods through the urban center. Customs officials, longshoremen, ship crews, and the various service workers who supported maritime commerce formed a network of individuals with high exposure to potentially infectious contacts from around the world. Dr. John Keegan, a physician working in Boston's hospitals who had observed the spring outbreak with professional interest, began noticing cases among longshoremen and merchant sailors that seemed more severe than typical seasonal influenza. These were men accustomed to hard physical labor and exposure to harsh conditions, individuals whose overall health and physical resilience should have provided protection against routine respiratory infections. What Dr. Keegan was observing, though he had no way of understanding it at the time, was the arrival of the second wave, a mutated version of the spring virus that had acquired the genetic changes necessary to become a truly devastating pathogen. This strain, which scientists would later designate as H1N1 and recognize as one of the most lethal pandemic influenzas in recorded history, possessed a unique combination of characteristics that made it extraordinarily dangerous to human populations. The virus was highly contagious, spreading easily through respiratory droplets produced by coughing, sneezing, or even normal conversation. It was virulent, capable of causing severe symptoms and rapid progression to life-threatening complications in previously healthy individuals. Most critically, it had acquired the ability to trigger the cytokine storm response that would prove fatal for many of its victims, turning the human immune system's protective mechanisms into instruments of destruction. The transformation from the mild summer strain to the lethal autumn variant represents one of nature's most dramatic examples of evolutionary pressure in action, though this process remained completely invisible to the medical professionals of 1918. The virus that had circulated quietly through human populations during the summer months had been subjected to the constant selective pressure of human immune systems, with countless opportunities for genetic variation and natural selection. Viral particles that could reproduce more efficiently, evade immune detection, and spread more rapidly within the population would have had a selective advantage, allowing them to become the dominant strain during the 1918 influenza pandemic, contributing to its unprecedented global impact.
As autumn deepened in 1918, the Spanish flu began to reveal its most insidious power, not merely its ability to kill, but its capacity to unravel the very threads that held communities together. Picture, if you will, the quiet desperation that settled over American towns and cities like a heavy blanket, muffling not just the sounds of daily life, but the connections between people that had defined civilization itself. The pandemic did not simply take lives, it dismantled the intricate web of relationships, traditions, and social structures that Americans had spent generations weaving together.
In boardrooms and schoolrooms, in churches and corner stores, in the intimate spaces of family homes, the virus forced a fundamental reckoning with what it meant to live in community with others. In the early days of October 1918, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell of Springfield, Massachusetts, noticed something peculiar happening in her neighborhood. The friendly waves exchanged between neighbors across front porches had ceased. The casual conversations that once bloomed naturally at the corner grocery store had withered into hurried, suspicious transactions. Children no longer gathered in spontaneous games of tag or marbles on the sidewalks. This transformation was not unique to Springfield. Across the nation, the pandemic was performing a cruel alchemy, transmuting the gold of human connection into the lead of mutual suspicion. Every cough became a potential death sentence. Every handshake carried the weight of mortal risk. The simple act of breathing in the presence of another human being had become an act of profound trust or reckless abandon. Imagine yourself walking down a main street in any American town during those October days. The familiar rhythms of commerce and community that had defined these spaces for decades were disrupted by an almost palpable tension. Shopkeepers served customers from behind hastily constructed barriers of glass or cloth. Mothers clutched their children closer, steering them away from other families with an urgency that spoke of genuine terror. The elderly, those wise repositories of community memory and tradition, found themselves suddenly quarantined not just by health orders, but by the fearful distance their own families now maintained. This erosion of trust manifested in ways both subtle and profound. In Chicago, long-time business partnerships dissolved as partners accused each other of reckless exposure. In small towns across Kansas, church congregations split along lines of pandemic response. Those who insisted on maintaining services in defiance of health orders, and those who viewed such gatherings as acts of communal suicide. The language people used began to change, taking on the vocabulary of war and siege. Neighbors were no longer simply neighbors, they were potential vectors of infection. Strangers were not fellow community members, but threats to be avoided. The pandemic had created a new social taxonomy based entirely on perceived risk. While trust eroded, the economic foundations of American life began to crack under pressures no one had anticipated. The pandemic struck at a time when the nation's economy was already strained by the demands of the Great War. But the flu introduced variables that no economic theory had prepared society to handle. Consider the plight of small business owners during those desperate months. Take, for instance, Samuel Chen, who owned a small restaurant in San Francisco's Chinatown. Before the pandemic, his establishment had served as more than just a place to eat. It was a community gathering spot where Chinese immigrants shared news from home, celebrated traditional festivals, and maintained the cultural connections that sustained them in a foreign land. When the flu arrived, Chen faced an impossible calculus. Remaining open meant risking the health of his customers and staff, but closing meant financial ruin, not just for himself, but for the extended network of suppliers, employees, and community members who depended on his business. The social safety net that might have supported such decisions simply did not exist in 1918 America. Chen chose to remain open. implementing what precautions he could, spacing tables further apart, requiring staff to wear cloth masks, opening windows despite the October chill. But as October wore on and the death toll in his neighborhood climbed, fewer and fewer customers dared to venture out. By November, he was serving perhaps a dozen meals a day instead of his usual 100. The careful balance of income and expenses that had sustained his business for years collapsed within weeks. This story repeated itself across America in thousands of variations. Barber shops, those traditional centers of male social life, found their chairs empty as men feared the intimacy required for a haircut and shave. Theaters and music halls, the cultural heartbeat of many communities, fell silent, not just because of official closures, but because audiences simply stopped coming. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual businesses. Entire supply chains began to fail as links in the economic network weakened or broke entirely. Farmers found themselves unable to get their produce to market as transportation workers fell ill. Factory owners discovered that even when they could keep their facilities open, finding healthy workers became increasingly difficult. In the textile mills of Massachusetts, production dropped by 60% between September and November 1918. The impact was felt not just in reduced output, but in the communities that depended on mill work for survival. Families that had maintained steady incomes for generations suddenly found themselves facing destitution. The social fabric of mill towns, built around the rhythms of industrial production, began to fray as unemployment spread and desperation took hold. Perhaps nowhere was the pandemic's impact more keenly felt than in the disruption of the small rituals that had given meaning and structure to American life. These seemingly minor customs, the weekly gathering for Sunday service, the daily walk to the corner store, the evening socializing on front porches, had provided the steady heartbeat of community life for generations. Religious observance, which had served as a cornerstone of American social life since the colonial period, faced unprecedented challenges. Churches across the nation grappled with impossible choices: maintain services and risk becoming centers of contagion, or close their doors and abandon their flocks during perhaps the greatest crisis of faith in living memory. The solutions various congregations devised revealed both human ingenuity and the depth of spiritual hunger that the pandemic could not entirely suppress. In rural Iowa, Pastor William Thornton began conducting services from his church steps, addressing congregants who gathered in the cemetery, maintaining careful distance among the headstones of previous generations. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present, the living gathering among the dead to seek solace from an invisible killer.
In Boston, Rabbi David Goldberg organized what he called porch services, walking through Jewish neighborhoods while families listened from their front steps and windows. These improvised gatherings lacked the formal structure of traditional worship, but they maintained connections that might otherwise have been severed entirely. The disruption of educational routines proved equally profound. Schools across America closed their doors, sending children home to an uncertain future. But the impact extended beyond simple interruption of classes. Schools had served as community centers, social hubs, and sources of shared identity.
When they closed, they took with them the elaborate ecosystem of social relationships they had fostered. Consider the experience of 12-year-old Mary O'Brien in Pittsburgh. Before the pandemic, her days had been structured around the familiar rhythms of school attendance. She walked the same route each morning with the same group of neighborhood children, participated in the same classroom discussions, played the same recess games. These routines had provided not just education, but socialization, exercise, and a sense of belonging to something larger than her immediate family. When schools closed in early October, Mary found herself confined to her family's small apartment with her 4 siblings and increasingly anxious parents. The space that had seemed adequate when it served primarily as an evening and weekend retreat suddenly became a prison. Children who had spent their days in the stimulating environment of classrooms and playgrounds now faced the prospect of months confined in cramped quarters with restless siblings and stressed adults. The psychological impact of this confinement manifested in ways that families were unprepared to handle. Children displayed increased irritability, anxiety, and what we might now recognize as symptoms of depression. Parents, already stressed by economic uncertainty and health fears, found themselves responsible for educational, social, and recreational needs they had never been expected to meet. The pandemic also accelerated changes in gender roles and expectations that had been slowly evolving throughout the early decades of the 20th century. As traditional male-dominated workplaces faced staffing shortages due to illness and death, opportunities opened for women that might otherwise have taken decades to emerge. In factories across the Midwest, women took on roles previously reserved exclusively for men. But this was not simply a matter of filling vacant positions. The nature of work itself was changing in response to pandemic conditions. The close physical proximity that had characterized much industrial labor became a liability. New work arrangements emerged that emphasized individual rather than team-based production, creating opportunities for women to demonstrate capabilities that had long been denied or ignored. Martha Stevens, a widow from Detroit, exemplifies this transformation. Before the pandemic, she had supported herself and her 2 children through piecework sewing she could do at home. When the local automotive plant faced severe labor shortages in November 1918, she was hired to operate machinery that would have been considered too complex or dangerous for women just months earlier. The work was challenging and exhausting, but it offered Martha something she had never experienced: economic independence and social recognition. Her weekly wages exceeded what she had been able to earn through months of piecework. More importantly, she found herself part of a community of working women who shared experiences, challenges, and aspirations that had largely been invisible in the pre-pandemic social structure. But these changes came at enormous personal cost. Martha's children, aged 8 and 10, were left largely to fend for themselves during her 12-hour shifts. The neighborhood networks of mutual support that might have helped care for working mothers' children had been shattered by pandemic fears. Children across America were growing up faster than previous generations, taking on responsibilities for household management, sibling care, and even family finances that would have been unthinkable in more stable times.
The traditional rituals of courtship and marriage faced particular disruption. Young couples found themselves unable to pursue the elaborate social dances that had previously governed romantic relationships. Church socials, community dances, and family gatherings, the traditional venues where young people met and relationships developed, disappeared almost overnight. Yet love, as always, found a way. New forms of courtship emerged that reflected pandemic realities. Couples conducted extended conversations from opposite sides of front porches. Love letters, already an established tradition, took on new urgency and intimacy as physical proximity became dangerous. Some couples made the radical decision to marry quickly before one or both might fall ill, leading to ceremonies conducted with minimal witnesses and maximum haste. Perhaps no group experienced the pandemic's social disruption more acutely than children. The elaborate world of childhood that had been developing throughout the early 20th century, with its structured play, organized education, and carefully supervised social interactions, collapsed within weeks. Children adapted to these changes with the remarkable resilience that has always characterized their response to crises. But the adaptations themselves revealed the profound nature of the social transformation taking place. In neighborhoods across America, children developed new games that reflected their pandemic reality. Flu tag became a common playground activity, where being caught meant pretending to be sick and isolated. The morbid nature of such play reflected children's attempts to process experiences that adults themselves struggled to understand. The collapse of normal educational routines forced families to confront questions about childhood development that had previously been delegated to professional educators. Parents found themselves responsible not just for basic childcare, but for intellectual stimulation, social development, and moral education. Many discovered that they were unprepared for these expanded responsibilities. The Williamson family in St. Louis exemplified both the challenges and opportunities this situation created. When schools closed, parents Robert and Helen faced the prospect of educating their 3 children, ages 6, 9, and 12, while managing their own pandemic-related stresses. Helen, who had received only an 8th grade education herself, worried about her ability to guide her children's learning. But the family also discovered unexpected opportunities for connection and growth. Without the external structure of school and work schedules, they developed new routines that brought them closer together. Evening became a time for reading aloud, sharing stories, and discussing the day's events in ways that had been rushed or eliminated entirely in their pre-pandemic life. The oldest child, Thomas, took on responsibilities for teaching his younger siblings basic arithmetic and reading, developing leadership skills and patience that might never have emerged in a conventional educational setting. The middle child, Sarah, discovered a talent for storytelling.
entertaining the family with elaborate tales that helped process the anxiety and uncertainty surrounding them.
Yet these positive adaptations came at a cost. The children's social development, which had previously occurred through interaction with peers from diverse backgrounds, now occurred almost exclusively within the family unit. The broader perspectives, social skills, and cultural awareness that typically developed through school attendance were replaced by the more limited worldview of their immediate household. As communities struggled to adapt to unprecedented challenges, many Americans looked to their leaders for guidance, support, and reassurance. What they found instead was often confusion, contradiction, and denial that deepened their sense of isolation and abandonment. Political leaders at every level found themselves facing decisions for which their training and experience had provided no preparation. The American political system, built on principles of limited government and individual responsibility, offered few mechanisms for coordinating a response to a crisis that transcended all traditional boundaries. Consider the experience of Mayor Thomas Fletcher in Kansas City, Missouri. A successful businessman who had run for office on a platform of fiscal responsibility and efficient government, Fletcher suddenly found himself responsible for making life-and-death decisions about school closures, business restrictions, and public gatherings. The city's budget, carefully planned around predictable revenues and expenses, became meaningless as tax collections plummeted and emergency expenses soared. Fletcher's attempts to balance competing demands revealed the impossible nature of pandemic leadership. Business owners demanded that the city remain open to prevent economic catastrophe. Medical professionals insisted on strict closures to prevent health disaster. Citizens wanted clear, consistent guidance, while simultaneously demanding that their individual circumstances be treated as special exceptions to general rules. The mayor's daily press conferences became exercises in diplomatic language that satisfied no one. Announcements of new restrictions were followed immediately by explanations of exceptions. Promises of economic support were hedged with disclaimers about budget limitations. Appeals for citizen cooperation were undermined by the obvious inability of city government to enforce its own guidelines. This pattern repeated itself across the nation. Governors found themselves caught between federal officials who minimized the pandemic's severity and local officials who demanded immediate action. Federal authorities, distracted by war concerns and hampered by limited public health infrastructure, provided guidance that was often contradictory, delayed, or simply irrelevant to local conditions. The failure of leadership extended beyond government into other institutions Americans had traditionally relied upon for guidance during crisis. Medical professionals, despite their technical expertise, often disagreed publicly about appropriate responses to the pandemic. These disagreements, played out in newspapers and public forums, undermined confidence in scientific authority just when it was most desperately needed. Religious leaders faced similar challenges. Traditional theological frameworks offered little guidance for understanding a disaster that seemed to strike the righteous and wicked with equal severity. Sermons that attempted to find divine purpose in mass death often rang hollow to congregants who had watched faithful church members die while notorious sinners survived. The economic elite, those captains of industry and finance who had positioned themselves as natural leaders of American society, proved equally inadequate to the moment. Their expertise in managing predictable business cycles offered little insight into navigating a crisis that defied all conventional economic logic. As official institutions failed, Americans began developing informal networks of support and cooperation that operated outside traditional social structures. These underground economies of care revealed both the resourcefulness of ordinary people and the inadequacy of existing social safety nets. In immigrant neighborhoods across America, extended family networks that had been crucial to survival in the old country were adapted to pandemic conditions in the New World. Italian families in Boston's North End developed elaborate systems for caring for the sick while protecting the healthy. Older women, considered too valuable to risk exposure, became coordinators of care networks, directing younger family members in the preparation and delivery of food, medicine, and comfort to afflicted households. These networks operated according to principles that bore little resemblance to the individualistic ethos that supposedly characterized American society. Resources were shared according to need rather than ability to pay. Labor was contributed based on capacity rather than formal employment relationships. Information flowed through channels built on trust and relationship rather than official authority. Similar networks emerged in African American communities, where experience with exclusion from white-dominated institutions had already necessitated the development of alternative support systems. Churches became not just centers of worship, but distribution hubs for food, medicine, and information. Ministers found themselves serving as informal public health officials, economic coordinators, and grief counselors. The flexibility and responsiveness of these informal networks often surpassed the capabilities of official institutions. When the Red Cross proved unable to provide adequate support to affected families in Philadelphia's black neighborhoods, local churches and mutual aid societies stepped in to fill the gap. Their volunteers, drawn from the community they served, understood local needs and conditions in ways that outside agencies never could. But these underground economies also revealed the profound inequalities that characterized American society. Communities with strong existing social networks were better able to adapt to pandemic conditions, while more fragmented areas struggled to develop effective response systems. Immigrant communities with experience in mutual aid thrived relative to native-born populations that had relied more heavily on formal institutions. The gender dynamics of these informal networks proved particularly revealing. Women, who had been largely excluded from formal economic and political power, emerged as crucial coordinators of survival efforts. Their traditional roles as caregivers and household managers translated directly into pandemic response capabilities. They organized food distribution, coordinated childcare, and maintained communication networks that kept communities functioning when official systems failed. The pandemic also created a new geography of risk that cut across traditional social and economic boundaries. Wealthy residential districts, with their large homes and spacious yards, initially seemed to offer protection from contagion. But their residents' connections to broader social and economic networks often made them more vulnerable to exposure. Business owners who insisted on maintaining operations, professionals who felt obliged to continue serving clients, and social leaders who refused to abandon their public roles all found themselves at risk despite their material advantages.
Working-class neighborhoods, meanwhile, developed their own logic of pandemic navigation. Residents who had always lived with economic uncertainty proved more adaptable to rapid changes in circumstances. Their experience with informal economic arrangements served them well when official systems broke down. Their smaller living spaces, initially seen as a disadvantage, sometimes fostered the close family relationships that proved crucial for survival. The physical infrastructure of different neighborhoods also played unexpected roles in determining pandemic outcomes. Areas with wide streets and open spaces allowed for social gatherings that maintained distance. Neighborhoods with front porches supported the kind of outdoor socializing that kept communities connected while reducing transmission risk. Areas designed around pedestrian rather than automobile traffic proved more conducive to the careful navigation of public space that pandemic conditions required. Transportation networks, the circulatory system of modern urban life, became vectors of both disease and survival. Streetcar lines that had previously brought neighborhoods together now became pathways for contagion. Workers who had no choice but to use public transportation found themselves facing impossible decisions between economic necessity and health safety. Yet the same transportation networks also enabled the informal distribution systems that kept communities functioning. Delivery workers, postal employees, and other transportation professionals became lifelines for isolated residents. Their willingness to continue working despite obvious risks maintained connections between households and neighborhoods that might otherwise have been completely severed. As the pandemic stretched from weeks into months, Americans developed new routines and rhythms that reflected their transformed circumstances. These adaptations created a new texture of daily life that bore little resemblance to pre-pandemic normalcy. Morning routines that had once been automatic became exercises in careful calculation. Before leaving home, workers now had to consider not just weather and schedule, but the health status of household members, the safety of planned routes, and the infection control measures required by their destinations. The simple act of getting dressed required decisions about protective clothing that would have been incomprehensible just months earlier. Meal times, traditionally occasions for family gathering and social connection, were restructured around health concerns. Families developed new patterns of eating that minimized shared contact with food and utensils. The communal preparation of meals, once a source of family bonding, gave way to more isolated cooking arrangements that reduced transmission risk. Shopping, that fundamental activity of consumer society, was transformed into a high-stakes exercise in risk assessment. Housewives who had previously enjoyed leisurely browsing through stores now approached shopping as military operations, requiring careful planning and rapid execution. Store visits were timed to avoid crowds, routes were planned to minimize exposure, and interactions with merchants were reduced to essential transactions. The evening hours, previously devoted to socializing and entertainment, became time for quiet family activities that could be pursued safely within the home. Reading aloud experienced a renaissance as families searched for shared activities that required no external contact. Card games and board games, gathering dust in many households during the busy pre-pandemic years, emerged as valuable tools for maintaining family cohesion. Letter writing, already in decline due to the telephone, experienced a dramatic resurgence as people sought ways to maintain relationships despite physical separation. The mail system became more than a delivery service. It became a lifeline connecting individuals to the broader world beyond their immediate households. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the pandemic's social impact was the way it changed the soundtrack of American life. Cities and towns that had buzzed with the constant hum of human activity fell into an eerie quiet that survivors would remember for decades to come. The absence of children's voices proved particularly unsettling. Playgrounds that had echoed with shouts and laughter stood empty. School bells that had marked the rhythm of community life fell silent. The casual conversations of neighbors, the friendly greetings exchanged on street corners, the spontaneous music of community life, all faded into memory. In their place came new sounds that reflected the pandemic reality. The measured cadence of funeral processions became a daily accompaniment to life in many neighborhoods. The calls of vendors who now announced their presence from the street rather than going door to door created a new form of commercial music. The sound of church bells, no longer calling people to worship, but marking the passage of empty time, took on new meaning. This transformation of the acoustic environment had psychological impacts that few fully understood at the time. The human need for social connection includes not just visual and physical contact, but the reassuring presence of familiar sounds that indicate community life continues. When those sounds disappeared, they took with them subtle but important signals of safety and belonging. The silence was not complete, of course. New sounds emerged to fill the void. The increased volume of domestic life, conversations, arguments, and activities that had previously been dispersed across various venues, now concentrated within homes, created a different kind of community noise. Neighbors became more aware of each other's private lives as the boundaries between public and private space shifted. Radio, still a relatively new technology, took on unprecedented importance as a source of both information and companionship. Families gathered around radio sets, not just for news and entertainment, but for the simple comfort of human voices that connected them to a wider world beyond their physical proximity. As we move toward understanding the pandemic's ultimate impact on American society, we begin to see how these social transformations laid the groundwork for the changed nation that would emerge from the crisis. The informal networks, adapted institutions, and new social practices developed during the pandemic months would prove to have lasting influence on American community life. The quiet desperation of autumn 1918 was simultaneously destroying an old social order and creating the conditions for a new one to emerge. As winter settled over America in late 1918, a different kind of cold seemed to penetrate the very soul of the nation. The Spanish flu had begun its gradual retreat, leaving behind a landscape forever altered, not just by the staggering number of the dead, but by the profound transformation in how the living understood their place in the world. Imagine, if you will, walking through any American town in those December days, where every street corner held the ghost of someone who would never return, and every family gathering bore the ache of empty chairs that would never again be filled. The pandemic had claimed somewhere between 650,000 and 675,000 American lives, a number so vast it defied comprehension. But statistics, however staggering, could never capture the true weight of what had been lost. In a nation of approximately 103 million people, this meant that virtually every American had been touched directly by death. There was no family, no community, no social network that remained intact. The very fabric of American society had been rewoven with black threads of grief running through every pattern.
The mathematics of loss revealed themselves in countless small ways that survivors would carry for the rest of their lives. Consider the experience of Mrs. Clara Hoffman in Milwaukee, who had raised 4 children to adulthood. John, the eldest at 28, a promising attorney. Margaret, 26, recently married with a baby daughter. William, 23, who had shown remarkable talent as a mechanical engineer, and young Rebecca, just 19, whose bright spirit had been the family's constant source of joy. The flu had taken John in early October, Margaret and her infant daughter in late October, and William in the first week of November. By Thanksgiving 1918, Clara sat at a dining table set for 6, but occupied by only herself and Rebecca. The careful choreography of holiday traditions, who carved the turkey, who said grace, who told the family stories, had been shattered. The conversations that had once filled their home with laughter now felt forced and hollow, punctuated by silences that seemed to echo with absent voices. This scene repeated itself across the nation with variations so numerous they created their own geography of grief. In farming communities across the Midwest, entire family lines had been extinguished, leaving fertile land with no heirs to work it. The careful knowledge passed down through generations, when to plant, how to read weather patterns, which fields were best suited for which crops, died with its keepers, creating an intellectual famine that would affect agricultural communities for decades to come.
In urban areas, the loss took different but equally profound forms. Ethnic neighborhoods that had maintained cultural traditions for decades of American assimilation found their older generations, the keepers of language, custom, and memory, decimated. The Italian grandmothers who had preserved regional recipes, the Irish storytellers who had maintained oral histories, the German craftsmen who had passed down specialized skills, all gone, taking with them irreplaceable threads in the tapestry of American cultural diversity. The workplace consequences of these losses created ripple effects that extended far beyond immediate economic impact. Small businesses built around family relationships collapsed entirely when key family members died. Law firms lost their senior partners and their institutional knowledge. Medical practices that had served communities for decades found themselves without the physicians who understood local health patterns and family histories. The apprenticeship systems that had sustained skilled trades faced catastrophic disruption when masters and apprentices alike succumbed to the flu. But perhaps no group faced a more profound adjustment than the children who had been orphaned by the pandemic. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 200,000 American children lost one or both parents to the flu, but this number likely underestimates the true scope of the crisis. Extended family networks that had previously provided safety nets for orphaned children had themselves been devastated by the pandemic. Young Timothy Morrison of Cleveland exemplified both the tragedy and resilience of these orphaned children. At 8 years old, he had lost both parents and his older sister within a 3-week period in November 1918. His surviving relatives, an aunt and uncle who lived across town, had their own family to care for and limited resources to support an additional child. Timothy found himself in the Cleveland Children's Home, one of thousands of similar institutions overwhelmed by the sudden influx of pandemic orphans. The orphanages of 1918 America were not prepared for such an overwhelming crisis. Built to house perhaps a few dozen children each, they suddenly found themselves caring for hundreds. The Cleveland Children's Home, typical of such institutions, had been designed to accommodate 30 children. By December 1918, it housed nearly 200. Dormitories meant for 4 children now held 12 or more. The careful attention to individual development that had characterized progressive approaches to child welfare became impossible when staff members were outnumbered 20 or 30 to 1. But Timothy's story also revealed the remarkable adaptability of children facing unthinkable circumstances. Within the orphanage's overcrowded conditions, the older children naturally assumed responsibility for younger ones, creating informal family structures that provided some measure of stability and affection. Timothy found himself in a family of 6 other boys, ranging in age from 6 to 14, led by Marcus, whose steady temperament and natural leadership had emerged in response to crisis. These artificial families developed their own traditions and support systems. Marcus taught the younger boys to read by sharing the few books available in the orphanage library. They created games from scraps of material and imagination. They told stories about their lost families, keeping memories alive through repetition and embellishment. They comforted each other through nightmares and helped each other navigate the complex emotions of grief, abandonment, and hope. The psychological impact of such massive childhood trauma would reverberate through American society for decades to come. These orphaned children grew up to become the adults of the 1930s and 1940s, carrying within them experiences of loss and resilience that would shape their approach to parenting, community building, and social responsibility. Their deep understanding of life's fragility would influence how they responded to subsequent crises, including the Great Depression and World War II. Many of these children also carried forward a profound appreciation for human connection that had been forged in the fires of loss. Having experienced the devastating consequences of death and separation, they often became adults who invested heavily in maintaining relationships and building strong community ties. The greatest generation that would face the challenges of the mid-20th century had been shaped in part by the pandemic losses of their childhood. The pandemic had also created a new map of America, one not drawn in state lines or county boundaries, but in the distribution of loss and recovery. Some communities had been devastated so completely that they never fully recovered their pre-pandemic character. Others, through a combination of geographical isolation, effective leadership, and simple luck, had emerged relatively intact but ever changed by their proximity to disaster. The mining town of Copper Ridge, Montana, had lost nearly 40% of its adult population to the flu. The tight-knit community, built around the dangerous work of extracting copper from the earth, had developed strong traditions of mutual support that served them well during the health crisis. But the human losses were so severe that the social structures themselves began to collapse. The town's school, which had served 120 children before the pandemic, reopened in January 1919 with only 38 students. The teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, found herself educating children whose grade levels ranged from 1st through 8th, many of whom had lost both parents and were living with relatives or neighbors who could barely manage their own households. The careful age-based progression that had characterized American education became impossible when entire age cohorts had been decimated. The economic base of Copper Ridge faced similar challenges. The mine itself remained profitable, but the skilled workforce that had made efficient operation possible had been shattered. Men who had worked together for decades, developing the subtle communication and cooperation that made dangerous underground work survivable, found themselves partnered with inexperienced workers or complete strangers. The informal knowledge networks that had kept the community safe and productive had been severed.
Yet Copper Ridge also demonstrated the remarkable resilience of human communities facing existential challenges. The surviving residents developed new traditions and support systems that reflected their transformed circumstances. The monthly community dinners, previously organized by the Women's Auxiliary of the Methodist Church, became informal gatherings where anyone could contribute whatever food they could spare. These meals served not just nutritional needs, but provided opportunities for sharing grief, celebrating small victories, and maintaining social connections. The town's approach to child-rearing was necessarily transformed by circumstances. With so many children orphaned or living in disrupted households, child care became a community responsibility rather than a family one. Elderly residents who had lost their own adult children found new purpose in caring for orphaned youngsters. Teenagers took on adult responsibilities for younger siblings or neighbors' children. The rigid boundaries between families that had characterized pre-pandemic social organization gave way to more fluid, inclusive definitions of kinship and responsibility. Religious institutions across America faced their own profound reckonings with the pandemic's aftermath. Churches, synagogues, and other houses of worship had served not only as centers of spiritual life, but as anchors of community identity and social support. The pandemic had challenged these institutions in ways that centuries of theological development had not prepared them to address. The fundamental question that haunted religious leaders and their congregations was both simple and unanswerable. How could a loving God have allowed such seemingly random and devastating suffering? Traditional explanations that framed disease as divine punishment for sin rang hollow when applied to pandemic losses that had struck the righteous and wicked with equal ferocity. Theological frameworks that emphasized divine plan and purpose struggled to find meaning in deaths that appeared arbitrary and senseless.
Father Michael O'Brien of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Boston exemplified the challenges facing religious leaders during this period. Before the pandemic, his parish had been a thriving community of nearly 800 families, primarily Irish immigrants and their descendants, who had built strong traditions around Catholic observance and mutual support. The flu had claimed 127 members of his congregation, including several families where every member had died. Father O'Brien found himself conducting funeral services almost daily throughout October and November 1918. The traditional rituals of Catholic burial, with their emphasis on community gathering and shared mourning, had to be adapted to pandemic conditions. Funeral masses were limited to immediate family members. Graveside services were abbreviated to minimize exposure. The elaborate wake traditions that had helped Irish families process grief and celebrate the lives of the departed were eliminated entirely. But perhaps more challenging than the logistical adaptations were the theological questions raised by parishioners who had watched their families destroyed by an invisible enemy that seemed to mock human attempts at comprehension. How could Father O'Brien counsel Mary Flanagan, who had lost her husband and 3 children within 2 weeks, to trust in God's plan? What comfort could traditional prayers offer to Patrick Sullivan, whose entire extended family had been wiped out, leaving him alone in a strange land? Father O'Brien's response revealed both the limitations and the resilience of religious faith in crisis. Unable to provide satisfactory explanations for the suffering he witnessed daily, he instead focused on the practical work of caring for survivors. His parish became a center for organizing food distribution, coordinating care for orphan children, and providing whatever material support could be mustered for families facing destitution. This shift from theological explanation to practical service characterized religious response across many denominations and communities. When traditional answers proved inadequate, religious leaders often found their most effective ministry in simply being present with those who suffered, in organizing concrete help for those in need, and in maintaining spaces where grief could be expressed and community connections preserved. The pandemic also accelerated changes in religious practice that had been slowly developing throughout the early 20th century. The elaborate ritual structures that had characterized much of American religious life gave way to more informal, emotionally direct approaches to worship. Prayer became less about formal recitation and more about personal conversation with the divine. Community religious life became less concerned with doctrinal precision and more focused on mutual support and shared experience. As America began to emerge from the immediate crisis of the pandemic, the physical spaces where life was lived bore the permanent marks of the experience. Homes, workplaces, schools, and public buildings had all been modified in response to health concerns, and many of these changes would prove lasting. The American home, that sanctuary of family life and personal identity, had been transformed by months of serving functions for which it had never been designed. Houses that had previously been primarily evening and weekend retreats had become schools, workplaces, medical facilities, and entertainment centers. The spatial organization of domestic life had been fundamentally altered by pandemic necessities. Consider the home of the Webster family in Springfield, Illinois. Before the pandemic, their modest 2-story house had been organized according to conventional early 20th century domestic architecture. The parlor served for formal entertaining, the dining room for family meals, the kitchen for food preparation, and the bedrooms for private rest and recuperation. Each space had its defined function and appropriate social use. The pandemic had scrambled these careful distinctions. When schools closed, the dining room became a classroom where Mrs. Webster attempted to continue her children's education. When Mr. Webster's accounting office closed, the parlor became his workspace, filled with ledgers and files that had previously been kept at his downtown office. When family members fell ill, bedrooms became isolation wards, where the healthy members of the household provided nursing care while trying to avoid infection themselves. These functional changes were accompanied by physical modifications that reflected new understandings of health and safety. Windows that had previously been opened only in warm weather now remained cracked year-round to ensure air circulation. Furniture was rearranged to maximize space between occupants during family activities. Elaborate draperies and carpeting that had been symbols of domestic prosperity were removed because they were believed to harbor germs and were difficult to sanitize. The kitchen, traditionally the domain of women and domestic servants, took on new importance as a center of health protection for the entire household. Food preparation became an exercise in infection control, with new emphasis on cleanliness and sanitation that went far beyond previous domestic standards. The knowledge and skills required for household management expanded dramatically to include basic medical care, primitive epidemiology, and health maintenance practices that had previously been the responsibility of medical professionals. American workplaces had undergone equally dramatic transformations that would have lasting implications for labor relations, industrial organization, and economic development. The pandemic had forced rapid experimentation with work arrangements that challenged fundamental assumptions about productivity, supervision, and worker cooperation.
The experience of the Acme Manufacturing Company in Detroit illustrated how pandemic necessities had accelerated changes that might otherwise have taken decades to implement. Before the flu crisis, Acme had operated according to traditional industrial principles that emphasized close supervision, standardized procedures, and tight control over every aspect of production. Workers labored in close proximity, sharing tools and workspaces in ways that maximized efficiency and minimized costs. The pandemic had made such arrangements impossible. Workers who had previously labored shoulder to shoulder were separated by distances that dramatically reduced the efficiency of cooperative tasks. Assembly line operations that had been the hallmark of modern manufacturing were redesigned to minimize worker interaction. Quality control procedures that had relied on multiple workers examining the same products had to be restructured around individual responsibility. But these changes also revealed possibilities for worker autonomy and satisfaction that had been obscured by pre-pandemic industrial organization. Workers who had previously been closely supervised found themselves trusted with greater independence and decision-making authority. The necessity of reducing supervision to minimize contact led to experiments in worker self-management that proved surprisingly effective. The flu crisis had also demonstrated the crucial importance of worker health to industrial productivity in ways that previous economic theory had not fully recognized. Employers who had previously viewed worker welfare as a cost to be minimized discovered that investments in health and safety could yield dramatic improvements in productivity and profitability.
These lessons would have profound implications for the development of American industrial relations in the following decades. The pandemic had provided a powerful demonstration of the interconnectedness of worker welfare and business success that would influence labor negotiations, workplace design, and corporate policy for generations to come. As winter turned toward spring in 1919, Americans began attempting to make sense of their experience through the written word. Letters, diaries, newspaper articles, and eventually books began to emerge that tried to capture the magnitude of what had been lost and the nature of what had been learned. The personal writings of pandemic survivors revealed both the inadequacy of language to capture such massive loss and the human drive to find meaning through narrative. Sarah Mitchell, a schoolteacher from Portland, Oregon, began keeping a detailed diary in December 1918, months after the flu had claimed her husband and 2 of her 3 children. Her entries revealed the day-to-day struggle of rebuilding life in the aftermath of catastrophic loss. December 15, 1918. Woke this morning and for just a moment forgot. Reached across the bed expecting to find James there. The emptiness of that space felt like falling into a well. How long before I stop expecting to find them? Her words captured something that official death statistics could never convey. The way loss permeated every moment of daily existence, turning simple activities into exercises of endurance. But Mitchell's diary also documented the slow emergence of new possibilities and connections. January 10, 1919. Mrs. Henderson from down the street brought soup again today. We sat and talked for nearly an hour. She lost her son Thomas, and we shared stories. There is a comfort in being with someone who understands this particular kind of emptiness. These personal documents began to reveal patterns in the process of individual and community recovery. The importance of shared grief became a recurring theme, as survivors discovered that healing required not just the passage of time, but active connection with others who had experienced similar losses. The necessity of creating new meaning from the ruins of old certainties emerged as a central challenge for those who had survived when so many others had not. The pandemic had also accelerated developments in Americans' understanding of mental health and psychological well-being. The sheer scale of grief and trauma that characterized post-pandemic America forced medical professionals to grapple with emotional and psychological disorders on a scale they had never encountered before. Dr. Margaret Thornton, one of the few female physicians practicing in Chicago, found her medical practice transformed by the pandemic's aftermath. Before the flu crisis, her patients had sought treatment primarily for physical ailments, injuries, infections, and the various chronic conditions that characterized early 20th century healthcare. In the months following the pandemic, she increasingly found herself treating what she described as ailments of the spirit. Patients complained of persistent fatigue that seemed unrelated to physical exertion. Mothers reported inability to care for their remaining children despite desperate desire to do so. Men described nightmares that left them unable to work effectively. Children displayed behavioral changes that ranged from extreme withdrawal to uncontrollable aggression. The vocabulary of medicine proved inadequate to describe, let alone treat, the psychological wounds the pandemic had inflicted. Dr. Thornton began developing treatment approaches that emphasized the social dimensions of healing. She organized support groups where patients could share their experiences with others who had faced similar losses. She encouraged the maintenance of routines and connections that provided structure and meaning. She worked with families to understand how grief affected different members differently and how they could support each other's healing. Her approach was intuitive rather than scientific,
the formal development of psychological medicine was still decades in the future. But her observations contributed to a growing understanding that human health involved more than just the physical body. The pandemic had demonstrated that communities could be infected with despair, just as they could be infected with disease, and that recovery required attention to social and emotional healing as well as physical recuperation. As spring arrived in 1919, one of the most remarkable responses to the pandemic's aftermath began to emerge. A grassroots movement led by some of the older children who had survived the crisis. These young people, who had been forced to assume adult responsibilities during the pandemic months, began organizing efforts to care for younger children and support families that were struggling with the aftermath of loss. 16-year-old Martha Jameson in Philadelphia became a representative figure in this informal children's crusade. Having lost both parents but survived along with her younger brother and sister, Martha had spent the winter months caring for her siblings while living with an aunt whose own household was severely strained by financial difficulties. Rather than simply focusing on her own family's survival, Martha began reaching out to other orphaned children in her neighborhood. Her efforts began modestly, organizing informal playgroups for children who had no safe place to gather, sharing food when families faced shortages, helping younger children with reading and arithmetic that their disrupted schooling had neglected. But Martha's work gradually expanded as she recognized the scale of need around her and her own capacity to make a difference.
By March 1919, Martha was coordinating a network of teenage volunteers who were providing after-school care for nearly 30 younger children whose families were struggling with pandemic aftermath. They had established informal schools in church basements and community centers where children could receive educational support that overwhelmed official institutions could not provide. They had organized food distribution networks that identified families facing hunger and connected them with resources. Most remarkably, these young people had begun developing their own approaches to dealing with grief and trauma that proved remarkably effective. They organized story circles where children could share memories of lost family members. They created art projects that allowed for emotional expression without requiring verbal articulation of complex feelings. They established memory gardens in vacant lots, where children could plant flowers or vegetables in honor of those who had died. The success of these youth-led initiatives revealed both the inadequacy of official social services and the remarkable resilience and creativity of young people facing unprecedented challenges. The children who had been forced to grow up too quickly during the pandemic months had developed skills, perspectives, and commitment to community service that would characterize their approach to social problems throughout their adult lives. As America began the slow process of rebuilding in 1919, the acoustic landscape of the nation began to change once again. The eerie silence that had characterized the pandemic months gave way to new sounds that reflected both loss and renewal. The sounds of recovery were different from the pre-pandemic soundtrack of American life, more tentative, more precious, more intentionally created and preserved. Children's voices returned to neighborhoods, but with a different quality than before. The spontaneous, carefree play that had characterized childhood before the pandemic was replaced by more structured, more carefully supervised activities. Parents who had witnessed the sudden loss of so many children were reluctant to allow the kind of unmonitored freedom that had previously characterized childhood. The sounds of play became more contained, more adult-mediated, more consciously protected. Church bells began ringing again for services rather than funerals,
but congregations that had been depleted by death gathered with a solemnity and gratitude that had not characterized pre-pandemic worship. The music of religious observance took on new emotional depth as survivors sang hymns of thanksgiving for their own survival, while mourning those who would never sing again. The sounds of commerce gradually returned to main streets across America, but business was conducted with a new awareness of fragility and mutual dependence. The casual conversations between merchants and customers that had previously focused on weather and local gossip now included careful inquiries about family health and offers of mutual support. Business relationships had been transformed by shared crisis into something more personal and more invested in community well-being. Schools that reopened in 1919 did so with classroom sounds that reflected their transformed student populations. Teachers found themselves educating children who had experienced trauma that no previous generation of American youngsters had faced. The rhythms of instruction had to accommodate students whose attention spans had been affected by grief, whose family circumstances required flexibility in attendance and homework expectations, and whose emotional needs demanded new approaches to classroom management and peer interaction. As we prepare to examine the long-term legacy of the 1918 pandemic, we can see how the weight of memory was already shaping the nation's future direction. The children who had survived would become adults who understood the fragility of life and the importance of community support in ways that would influence American social development for decades to come. The families that had been broken and reformed would create new traditions and expectations that reflected hard-won wisdom about what truly mattered in human life. The communities that had been tested by unprecedented challenges would emerge with new capacity for cooperation, resilience, and mutual care that would serve them well in future crises. As we draw to the close of our journey through America's most profound health crisis, imagine yourself standing in a quiet cemetery on a spring morning in 1920, nearly 2 years after the Spanish flu first arrived on American shores. The daffodils are pushing through the earth around headstones that mark lives cut short. And there's a quality to the light, gentle, filtered through leaves just beginning to unfurl, that speaks of renewal and remembrance intertwined. The silence here is different from the terrible quiet that had settled over the nation during those dark months of 1918. This is a peaceful silence, full of memory and meaning, carrying within it the whispered stories of all those who had passed and all those who had endured. The pandemic that had swept across America like a dark tide had finally receded, but it had left the shoreline of the nation permanently altered. The contours of American society, its values, its institutions, its understanding of what it meant to live in community with others, had been reshaped by forces that few had understood and none had been prepared to meet. In the gentle morning light of this imagined cemetery, we can begin to see the full scope of that transformation and understand how the silent spring of 1919 would echo through the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The most profound lesson that the pandemic had taught America was one that the nation had spent its first century and a half steadily forgetting: the fundamental fragility of human existence and human civilization. The confident march of progress that had characterized the American 19th century, the conquest of a continent, the triumph over slavery, the rapid industrialization that had made the United States a world power, had fostered a collective belief in American exceptionalism that extended to Americans' understanding of their own mortality. The pandemic had shattered that confidence with devastating thoroughness. In the space of 18 months, Americans had learned that their prosperity could not protect them from disease, that their technology could not shield them from natural forces, and that their democratic institutions could not guarantee effective response to crisis. The virus had been utterly indifferent to American notions of manifest destiny, individual liberty, and national greatness. This lesson in humility had profound implications for how Americans would approach subsequent challenges throughout the 20th century. The generation that had lived through the pandemic brought to the Great Depression a hard-won understanding of economic vulnerability that shaped their response to massive unemployment and business failure. They had already learned that prosperity could disappear overnight, and that survival often depended on community cooperation rather than individual initiative. When World War II demanded unprecedented levels of national sacrifice and coordination, Americans drew upon organizational skills and community resilience that had been forged during the pandemic years. The ability to ration resources, to subordinate individual preferences to collective needs, and to maintain social cohesion despite enormous stress. All of these capacities had been developed during the months when the flu had tested every assumption about American life.
The pandemic's lesson in fragility also shaped American approaches to public health and social welfare in ways that would become increasingly apparent as the century progressed. The recognition that individual health was intimately connected to community health provided intellectual foundation for public health initiatives, social insurance programs, and collective approaches to medical care that would have been difficult to imagine before the pandemic demonstrated their necessity. Perhaps more subtle, but equally significant, was the way the pandemic had shifted fundamental American values in directions that would only become fully apparent decades later. The individualistic ethos that had characterized much of 19th century American culture had been tempered by painful lessons about interdependence and mutual vulnerability. The families that had survived the pandemic did so not through individual strength or virtue, but through networks of support that transcended traditional boundaries of kinship, ethnicity, and economic class. Children had been cared for by neighbors when parents died. Food had been shared across household lines when economic disruption left families destitute. Medical care had been provided by volunteers when professional health systems collapsed. These experiences of mutual aid had created lasting bonds and established expectations about community responsibility that would influence American social development for generations. The pandemic had also fostered a new appreciation for simple pleasures and ordinary relationships that had been taken for granted before crisis made them precious. Families that had been reunited after months of separation and fear developed traditions of gathering and celebration that emphasized gratitude for mere survival. Communities that had watched neighbors die learned to value the everyday interactions, the casual conversations, the shared meals, the informal cooperation that made life meaningful even when it was not prosperous or exciting. This shift in values was perhaps most apparent in changing attitudes toward work and economic success. The pandemic had demonstrated that professional achievement and material accumulation offered no protection against the fundamental uncertainties of existence. Success came to be measured less by individual accumulation and more by the strength of relationships and the resilience of communities. The children who had grown up during the pandemic years carried these values into adulthood with particular force.
Having witnessed the sudden loss of everything their families had worked to build, they tended to invest less emotional energy in material accumulation and more in maintaining strong social connections. Having seen how quickly normal life could be disrupted, they developed capacities for adaptation and cooperation that served them well during subsequent crises. The physical landscape of America also bore permanent reminders of the pandemic experience that would continue to influence how Americans understood their relationship to mortality, community, and each other. Cemeteries that had been expanded rapidly during 1918 and 1919 became places of pilgrimage for survivors who returned year after year to maintain connections with the dead and to remember the lessons their loss had taught them. But the pandemic's influence on American physical space extended far beyond burial grounds. The modifications to homes, schools, workplaces, and public buildings that had been made in response to health concerns became permanent features of the built environment. Houses designed or renovated during the pandemic years incorporated better ventilation, more flexible room arrangements, and spaces that could accommodate the kind of home-based work and education that crisis had demanded. Schools that were rebuilt after the pandemic reflected new understanding of the relationship between physical environment and community health. Classrooms were designed with larger windows, better air circulation, and more space between students. But they also incorporated features that reflected lessons about the importance of emotional and social support, libraries that served as community centers, cafeterias that could function as meeting spaces, and playgrounds designed to accommodate both organized activities and informal social interaction. The workplace modifications that had emerged from pandemic necessity became permanent features of American industrial organization. The recognition that worker health was essential to productivity led to investments in workplace safety, environmental quality, and employee welfare that extended far beyond minimum requirements. The experiments in flexible work arrangements and employee autonomy that had been necessitated by pandemic conditions influenced management philosophy and labor relations throughout the following decades. As the 1920s progressed, the written record of the pandemic experience began to mature from immediate personal testimony into more reflective analysis of what the crisis had revealed about American society and human nature. The memoirs, novels, poems, and essays that emerged during this period created a literature of pandemic experience that would continue to influence American cultural understanding long after the immediate participants had passed away. These works shared certain common themes that reflected the depth of the transformation the pandemic had wrought. The fragility of human plans and ambitions became a recurring motif, but not in a spirit of despair or cynicism. Instead, writers who had lived through the pandemic found in that fragility a reason for deeper appreciation of whatever time and connection were available.
The importance of community resilience emerged as another central theme. Writers documented the informal networks of support that had sustained communities during crisis, celebrating the quiet heroism of ordinary people who had cared for neighbors, shared resources, and maintained hope when official institutions had failed. These stories provided models for community building that would influence American approaches to social organization throughout the century. The pandemic literature also grappled with questions of meaning and purpose that the crisis had raised but not resolved. How should people live knowing that death could come suddenly and without warning?
What responsibilities did individuals have to their communities, and what could communities reasonably demand of individuals? How could people maintain hope and purpose in the face of seemingly arbitrary suffering? The answers that emerged from this literature were characteristically American in their combination of pragmatism and idealism. Life should be lived fully but not recklessly, with attention to both individual fulfillment and community welfare. Responsibilities to others were not burdens to be reluctantly accepted, but opportunities for meaningful engagement with the world. Hope was not naive optimism, but a commitment to continued effort despite uncertainty about outcomes. By the mid-1920s, it had become apparent that the pandemic had created an invisible infrastructure of social resilience that would serve American communities well during subsequent challenges. The networks of mutual support that had developed during the crisis did not simply disappear when the immediate emergency passed. Instead, they evolved into more permanent forms of community organization that provided ongoing resources for addressing local problems and opportunities. Churches that had served as centers of relief and coordination during the pandemic continued to function as hubs of community service. The soup kitchens, childcare programs, and support groups that had emerged from crisis necessity became permanent features of religious community life. The ecumenical cooperation that had developed when survival mattered more than doctrinal difference created lasting patterns of interfaith collaboration. Neighborhood associations that had formed to coordinate pandemic response evolved into organizations that addressed housing, education, and economic development issues. The leadership skills that women had developed while coordinating care and relief efforts translated into increased participation in civic and political life. The young people who had assumed adult responsibilities during the crisis brought to their adult years an understanding of civic engagement as essential rather than optional. Perhaps most importantly, the pandemic had created a shared vocabulary for discussing community needs and collective action. Americans who had lived through the crisis had learned to think in terms of mutual vulnerability and interdependence. They had developed practical experience in resource sharing, cooperative problem solving, and collective decision-making. These skills and perspectives would prove invaluable as the nation faced the economic challenges of the 1930s and the military challenges of the 1940s. The children who had survived the pandemic carried its lessons into the latter half of the 20th century in ways that continued to influence American social and political development. These were the Americans who would build the social safety net of the New Deal, who would mobilize for World War II, and who would create the post-war institutions that defined American prosperity and global leadership. Their approach to these challenges was profoundly shaped by pandemic experience. Having witnessed the collapse of seemingly stable institutions, they brought to nation-building efforts a healthy skepticism about institutional permanence and a commitment to building redundancy and flexibility into social systems. Having experienced the life-saving importance of community cooperation, they were more willing than previous generations to accept government programs and social institutions that fostered collective welfare. The pandemic generation also carried forward a particular understanding of American exceptionalism that was both more humble and more confident than what had come before. They understood that America was not exempt from the natural forces that affected all human societies, but they had also experienced the remarkable capacity of American communities to adapt, innovate, and support each other during crisis. Their patriotism was based not on illusions of invulnerability, but on proven capacity for resilience and mutual care. As these Americans became parents and grandparents, they passed on values and skills that reflected their pandemic experience. They taught their children to appreciate stability while preparing for change, to value individual achievement while maintaining community connections, and to approach the future with hope tempered by realism. The greatest generation that would define mid-20th century America had been shaped by their encounter with the Spanish flu as much as by their subsequent experiences of depression and war. As we stand in our imagined cemetery on this spring morning in 1920, we can sense how the echoes of the pandemic experience will continue to reverberate through American history long after the last survivor has passed away. The lessons learned during those terrible and transformative months would influence American responses to subsequent health crises, economic challenges, and social disruptions throughout the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The pandemic had taught Americans that their individual fates were inextricably linked to the welfare of their communities. This understanding would provide the intellectual and emotional foundation for collective approaches to social problems that might otherwise have been seen as purely individual concerns. The social security system, the GI Bill, the public health infrastructure, and the civil rights movement all drew on moral and practical lessons that had been learned during the pandemic years. The crisis had also demonstrated the importance of scientific research and public health infrastructure in maintaining social stability and economic prosperity. The investments in medical research, hospital systems, and disease surveillance that would characterize mid-20th century America reflected hard-won understanding of the connections between individual health and national security. Perhaps most importantly, the pandemic had revealed the remarkable capacity of ordinary Americans to rise to extraordinary challenges when their community's survival was at stake. This knowledge would provide confidence and courage for subsequent generations facing their own unprecedented challenges, from the Great Depression through World War II to the social transformations of the 1960s and beyond. As our journey through America's encounter with the Spanish flu draws to a close, we return to the quiet cemetery where we began this final reflection. The morning light has grown stronger now, warming the stone markers and the earth around them. In this peaceful setting, surrounded by memorials to those who died too young and too suddenly, we can appreciate both the magnitude of what was lost and the significance of what was learned.
The pandemic of 1918 and 1919 had been a great interruption in the American story, a forced pause in the nation's confident march toward prosperity and global dominance. During that pause, Americans had been compelled to confront fundamental questions about the nature of community, the meaning of progress, and the sources of human resilience that they might otherwise have continued to avoid or postpone. The answers they found were not simple or complete, but they were profound enough to influence the trajectory of American development for the remainder of the century. The recognition that individual welfare depended on community health, that prosperity required social cooperation, and that progress demanded attention to the vulnerable as well as the successful, These insights would shape American approaches to domestic policy, international relations, and social development long after the immediate pandemic crisis had passed. In the gentle silence of this spring morning, we can hear the continuing echo of those lessons. They whisper to us across the decades, reminding us that human civilization is always more fragile than it appears, that community resilience is always more important than individual achievement, and that the capacity for mutual care and support is perhaps the most valuable inheritance any generation can leave to those who follow. The Spanish flu had forced America to go silent for a season, but from that silence had emerged a deeper understanding of what it meant to live together on this earth. The voices that would emerge from that silent spring would speak with new wisdom about the connections that sustain us, the responsibilities that bind us, and the hope that carries us forward even when the future remains uncertain. As the morning grows warmer and the cemetery fills with the sounds of awakening life, birds beginning their daily songs, the rustle of new leaves in the breeze, the distant hum of a world beginning another day, we can sense that the great silence of 1918 had not been an ending, but a beginning. From that profound pause in the American story had come new understanding, new capacities, and new commitment to the ongoing work of building communities worthy of the human spirit. The pandemic was over, but its teachings would endure, woven into the fabric of American memory, and passed down through generations who would face their own challenges armed with hard-won wisdom about what it means to survive together and what it costs to learn to care for one another when everything else falls away.